Story 1. The Burden of the Unseen Milestone. The merchant stood upon the parched earth of the Magadha plains, feeling the cumulative weight of 40 summers pressing against the marrow of his bones. His cart was laden with fine silks and heavy spices, yet the gravity that threatened to buckle his knees originated from an invisible inventory of expectations and the silent accumulation of his own history. As he watched the dust rise in slow, rhythmic clouds around his feet, he recognized the peculiar sadness of the middle years, a period where the horizon no longer whispers of infinite possibilities, but instead speaks of the inevitable narrowing of the path. This was the milestone of the householder, a psychological structure built from the bricks of responsibility and the mortar of habit. He looked toward the shaded grove where the Buddha sat in silent repose, a figure that seemed to exist outside the frantic measurements of time. The merchant's mind was a chaotic loom, weaving patterns of regret over the threads he had failed to pull and anxiety over the fraying edges of his current existence. He approached the periphery of the grove, not with a question, but with the heavy silence of a man who had realized that his successes were merely gilded cages. Internal transformation began not with a sudden light, but with the slow dissolution of the merchant's identification with his cargo. He observed how his mind reflexively calculated the value of every object, every relationship, and even the very air he breathed, as if life were a debt that could never be fully repaid. In the presence of the awakened one, the merchant's internal dialogue began to stutter. He noticed the way his ego clung to the narrative of being a provider, a master, and a man of substance, and he saw how these labels were the primary sources of his exhaustion. The Buddha did not look up, yet the merchant felt an immense pressure lifting from his shoulders, as if the conceptual weight of his 40 years was being redistributed into the vastness of the surrounding forest. He realized that the sadness he felt was not a sign of failure, but the natural friction of a soul attempting to outgrow its current vessel. The mind, so long accustomed to the noise of the marketplace, found itself descending into a profound and terrifying stillness. In this void, the merchant saw that his life was not a series of achievements to be guarded, but a flow of phenomena that required no owner. The milestones of samsara were revealed to be markers of attachment rather than progress. He sat by the road, letting the oxen graze freely, and watched as the sun dipped below the rim of the world. The internal movement was subtle yet seismic, a shifting of the tectonic plates of his identity. He understood then that the heaviness of midlife was simply the weight of holding on to a self that was never truly there. The silence of the forest entered him, and for the first time in 2 decades, the merchant breathed without the need to justify his existence. The road ahead remained the same, but the one who walked it had begun to vanish into the rhythm of the eternal present. He saw his past as a shed skin, a discarded layer of perception that no longer defined the quality of his consciousness. The sadness dissolved into a neutral clarity, a spaciousness that could contain both the arrival of the night and the departure of his youth. He was no longer a man seeking an escape from the world, but a mind recognizing its own inherent freedom from the constructs of time and gain. Story 2. The Mirror of the Receding Tide. The Brahmin scholar sat upon the damp stones of the Ganges, watching the river carry away the remnants of the morning's offerings. His hands, once steady enough to transcribe the most intricate Sanskrit verses, now possessed a subtle tremor that spoke of the encroaching autumn of his life. He had spent 50 years accumulating the architectures of logic and the scaffolding of theology, believing that the height of his intellectual tower would eventually grant him a view of the absolute. Yet, as the middle of his life passed into the long shadows of the late afternoon, he found that the more he knew, the more profound his sense of isolation became. The water flowed past him with a relentless indifference, a liquid metaphor for the transience of all mental formations. He looked up to see a group of monks walking slowly along the riverbank, their robes the color of the setting sun, following the Buddha toward the city of Varanasi. The scholar felt a pang of resentment, a sharp cognitive dissonance arising from the contrast between his complex internal library and the apparent simplicity of the mendicants. He began to examine the structure of his own suffering, dissecting it with the precision of a surgeon. He realized that his sadness was rooted in the desperate desire for permanence, a longing for his thoughts and his legacy to remain fixed like the stars in the night sky. The mind, he observed, was a weaver of illusions, constantly creating the fiction of a central observer who stood apart from the flow of experience. He watched a single leaf caught in an eddy, spinning in circles before being pulled into the main current. His life was that leaf, and his intellect was the futile attempt to swim against the gravity of the river. The transformation was not an intellectual breakthrough, but an experiential surrender. He saw how his attachment to his status as a scholar had become a barrier to the very truth he sought. The Buddha's presence, even from a distance, acted as a silent catalyst for the Brahman's deconstruction. He began to let go of the need to name the world, my, observing the water not as an object of study, but as a direct manifestation of change. The sadness of midlife was revealed to be the grief of the ego as it realizes its own obsolescence. He felt the layers of his identity peeling away like the bark of a birch tree, exposing a raw and luminous awareness that was not bound by his personal history. The internal rhythm of his thoughts slowed, matching the pulse of the river. He understood that the milestones of samsara were not obstacles to be overcome, but illusions to be seen through. The fear of death and the regret of aging were merely secondary ripples on the surface of a deep and tranquil sea. As the first stars began to appear, the scholar realized that he was not the one watching the river, but rather, he was the river itself, flowing and changing with every passing moment. The heavy volumes of his memory seemed to dissolve into the mist rising from the water. He stood up, his tremor still present but no longer a source of distress, for he had found a center that did not move even as everything else shifted. The sadness had been a messenger, telling him that his old way of being was no longer sustainable. He walked away from the stones, leaving behind the Brahman and carrying only the empty vessel of a mind that had finally learned how to listen to the silence between the waves. The weaver in the outskirts of Rajgir lived within a world defined by the rhythmic tension of the warp and the weft, a microcosm of cedar wood and tightened silk that had occupied her attention for over 30 years. As she sat in the golden humidity of the late afternoon, she observed the movement of her own hands, noting with a detached sorrow how the skin had become like parched earth, mapped with the fine lines of 1,000 completed garments. This was the milestone of the middle years, the realization that the fabric of her life was being woven from the same recurring patterns of desire and necessity, a cycle that offered no ultimate conclusion but only the exhaustion of the material. She watched her mind as it sought to find meaning in the repetition, grasping at the hope that the next cloth would finally be the one to justify the decades of labor. Yet, the internal observer within her began to see the futility of this pursuit, recognizing that the weaver and the woven were both caught in a structural loop of samsara. The Buddha passed by the edge of her hut, his footsteps making no sound on the dry grass, his presence a silent reminder of a state that existed beyond the friction of becoming. The weaver did not look up, but her mind began to unravel the narrative of her own importance. She saw how her sadness was not a product of her aging body, but a result of the mind's desperate attempt to maintain a sense of continuity in a world of flux. The loom was no longer a tool for production, but a mirror reflecting the relentless repetition of her own thoughts. She noticed how each thought was like a single thread, seemingly significant in isolation, but ultimately lost in the vast and indifferent design of existence. The sadness shifted into a profound curiosity about the space between the threads, the silence that allowed the noise of the shuttle to exist. She began to contemplate the nature of the gap, finding that her midlife crisis was actually a door opening into the void. Her mind, which had spent 40 years calculating the cost of silk and the time of delivery, started to dissolve into the stillness of the afternoon. She saw that the milestones of her life, her marriage, the birth of her children, the deaths of her parents, were merely knots in a string that had no beginning and no end. The internal transformation was characterized by a slow cooling of the fires of ambition. She realized that the cloth would never be truly finished, because the concept of a finished cloth was an illusion created by a mind that feared the infinite. As the shadows of the mango trees lengthened across her floor, the weaver felt the weight of her identity as a creator slipping away. She was no longer a woman weaving a life, but a field of awareness in which weaving was simply happening. The midlife sadness was the friction of the old self resisting this expansion. By allowing the resistance to melt, she found a strange and terrifying freedom in the realization that she had nothing to complete and nowhere to go. The movement of her hands became an effortless dance, a participation in the flow of the universe that required no recognition. She understood that the Buddha did not teach how to weave a better life, but how to step out of the loom altogether. Story 4. The Echo in the Vaulted Chamber. The minor king of a small province in the foothills of the Himalayas sat within his basalt hall, a space designed to amplify his voice and diminish the presence of those who stood before him. At 50 years of age, he found that the silence of the stone was becoming louder than the petitions of his subjects or the flatteries of his ministers. He looked at the heavy iron rings on the doors and the thick tapestries depicting the conquests of his ancestors, and he felt a crushing sense of claustrophobia within the very fortress he had spent his life defending. This was the milestone of power, the psychological realization that the summit of authority is a barren peak where the air is too thin to sustain the ego. His mind was a complex network of strategies and defenses, a fortress within a fortress, constantly scanning for threats and calculating the loyalty of his allies. However, the midlife sadness that had settled over him was not born of external danger, but of an internal vacancy that no amount of territory could fill. He observed the movement of a single fly across the cold floor, noting how his mind immediately categorized it as an intruder, a nuisance to be eliminated. He then saw the absurdity of this reaction, realizing that his entire life had been a series of such categorizations, a desperate attempt to impose order on a reality that was fundamentally chaotic. The Buddha had recently stayed in a grove just outside the palace walls, and the king had watched from his balcony as the monks begged for their single meal of the day. He had been struck by the dignity of their poverty, a quality that his own wealth seemed unable to purchase. The king's internal transformation began as he started to investigate the nature of the I that claimed ownership of the province. He saw that the king was merely a collection of mental projections, a mask that had fused to his face until he could no longer breathe. He recognized the radical impermanence of his reign, seeing that his throne was nothing more than a temporary arrangement of atoms in a vast and shifting cosmos. The sadness he felt was the grieving of a ghost for a body it never truly inhabited. As he sat in the deepening gloom of the hall, He allowed the structures of his authority to crumble within his awareness. He did not abdicate his throne in the physical sense, kas, but he abdicated the psychological attachment to the role. He watched as his anxiety about the future and his regret about the past dissolved into the neutral gray of the stone walls. The mind, once a frantic commander, became a quiet observer of its own processes. He felt the boundary between himself and the world beginning to blur, as if the basalt walls were becoming porous. The milestone of samsara was revealed to be the point where the ruler realizes he is a servant to his own illusions. By accepting this, the king found a peace that was not dependent on the stability of his borders or the size of his treasury. He saw that the midlife sadness was the necessary decay of the false self, the clearing of the ground so that something more authentic could emerge. The hall was no longer an echoing chamber of his own ego, but a space of vast and silent potential. He understood that true sovereignty was not the power to command others, but the freedom from the need to command anything at all. The night air, cooling the stones of the palace, felt like a benediction upon a man who had finally stopped trying to be a monument. The potter of Shravasti lived her life through the tactile resistance of the earth, her fingers perpetually stained with the heavy gray silt of the riverbanks that fed the plains of Kosala. At 48 years of age, she began to perceive a subtle yet profound shift in the fundamental relationship between her artistic intent and the medium she had sought to master through decades of repetition. The clay, once a submissive and fluid partner in her creative dialogue, now seemed to possess a stubborn and archaic memory of its own, a quiet refusal to hold the intricate shapes she had perfected over 30 years of labor. This was the milestone of the decaying form, a psychological threshold where the mind finally realizes that the instruments of its expression are as ephemeral as the objects they strive to create. She sat before her wheel in the cooling shade of her porch as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, watching the spinning circle of mud and water, and felt a deep, resonant sadness that felt like the slow drying of a forgotten riverbed. Her mind was a kiln of its own making, firing the experiences of her past into rigid and brittle structures of identity: the mother, the widow, the master artisan. And she saw how these hardened shapes were now prone to shattering under the weight of the changing seasons. The Buddha was teaching in the nearby Anathapindika Park, and though she did not join the throngs of seekers, his presence felt like a silent vibration in the air, unsettling the sediment of her certainty and making the walls of her selfhood feel thin and porous. She observed her internal movement with a clinical and detached precision, noting how her ego grasped at the spinning wheel as if it could control the velocity of her own aging or the inevitable thinning of her breath. The sadness was not an emotion to be solved or a problem to be dismissed, but a structural reality of a consciousness that had mistaken the container for the content. She recognized that her midlife distress was the friction between the fluid nature of her awareness and the static image she held of herself. As she pressed her thumbs into the center of a fresh mound of clay, she felt the radical fragility of the moment, a realization that every shape was merely a temporary pause in a continuous and indifferent process of dissolution. The internal transformation occurred when she stopped trying to prevent the clay from collapsing and instead began to find the beauty in the collapse itself. She saw that the milestones of samsara were not markers of progress toward a destination, but the repeated cycles of a mind that had forgotten its own inherent emptiness. Her thoughts, which had once been heavy with the need for validation and the fear of being forgotten, became light and spacious like the unbaked earth before it meets the fire. She understood that the sadness of her middle years was the necessary breaking of the vessel, a psychological shattering that allowed the light of unconditioned awareness to penetrate the darkness of her habituated life. The spinning wheel became a metaphor for the revolving nature of desire, and for the first time in 40 years, she felt no need to reach out and touch it. She sat in the silence of her workspace, watching the dust motes dance in a shaft of golden light, and realized that the potter and the pot were both illusions rising from the same primordial ground. The sadness evaporated into a state of quiet observation, where the passage of time was no longer a threat, but a gentle unfolding of the inevitable. She was no longer a woman losing her youth, but a mind discovering its own timelessness in the very heart of decay. The clay remained on the wheel, formless and expectant, and she found that she was finally content to leave it exactly as it was, a silent testament to the freedom found in the cessation of the need to mold the world. Story 6. The Path of the Nameless Traveler. The monk who had once been a soldier in the armies of Magadha walked the narrow trails of the Vulture Peak, his feet accustomed to the bite of the sharp stones and the rhythmic demand of the ascent. Having joined the Sangha at the age of 52, he carried within him a mental landscape scarred by the memory of battlefields and the heavy silence of the men he had led and the men he had lost. As he looked out over the vast valley below, he encountered the milestone of the exhausted will, a psychological realization that the battles he had fought in the name of duty were merely external projections of an internal war that could never be won by force. The sadness that permeated his middle years was not a grief for the fallen, but a profound weariness of the I that had spent a lifetime trying to conquer and secure a world that refused to be held. He watched his mind as it attempted to organize his memories into a coherent narrative of honor or regret, and he saw how this very organization was the source of his bondage. The Buddha sat further up the mountain, a figure that seemed to be composed of the same stillness as the ancient rocks, and the monk felt the gravitational pull of a state of being that required no armor. He began to deconstruct the structure of his own bravery, seeing it as a desperate defense against the fear of non-existence. The transformation was a slow and deliberate disengagement from the mechanics of his own history. He noticed how his mind reflexively looked for an enemy, a goal, or a territory to defend. And he began to allow these impulses to arise and dissolve without following their lead. This was the milestone of the unborn, where the seeker realizes that the true self is not a participant in the drama of samsara, but the silent space in which the drama unfolds. The sadness of his midlife was revealed to be the final protest of the ego as it faced its own fundamental emptiness. He saw that his identity as a soldier was a ghost form, a collection of habits and reactions that had no central core. As he sat upon a ledge overlooking the darkening forest, he felt the weight of his 50 years being absorbed by the mountain, leaving only a clear and luminous awareness that was not bound by time or rank. The internal rhythm of his life, once a frantic march toward some distant victory, slowed into a profound and silent presence. He understood that the milestones of the Buddha were not stages of an external journey, but the various ways the mind learns to let go of its own fabrications. The sadness he had carried for so long was the friction of his attachment to a self that was in a state of constant departure. By ceasing to cling to the departing self, he found a peace that was as vast and unshakable as the peak upon which he sat. The memories of the wars he had fought did not vanish, but they lost their power to define the quality of his consciousness. They became like clouds passing over the surface of a deep lake, leaving no trace upon the water. He was no longer a man seeking to escape the sadness of his past, but a mind that had realized that the past and the future were merely conceptual shadows cast by the flickering lamp of the ego. The mountain air was cold and pure, and as he closed his eyes, he found that the traveler and the road had become one. and the need for a destination had vanished into the stillness of the night.